Hello, everyone, and welcome. We are now jumping from the Declaration and the Constitution, those two founding documents, into our set of 4 founding ideas or major themes that we will see recurring again and again throughout American public discourse, and throughout American history, throughout American law, throughout American policy. These are 4 key themes that we're going to talk about over the next 4 weeks. And the first of those is going to be race, specifically talking about the origins of Black chattel slavery in the United States of America. And this is going to start a lot earlier than what many of you are familiar with. This isn't the Civil War, this isn't even the Revolutionary War, or even 1619, as the New York Times would have it. We are going to go back much further than that, because what we really want to wrestle with here is the ideas that shaped rhetoric, right? We want to wrestle with how did rhetoric construct the America we live in today, and how do rhetorics of race and racism play into that American discourse. As we have already read in the Constitution, as we've already seen in the Declaration of Independence, concepts of race, who was and was not American based on whatever race was defined as at the time, are central to our documents. They are a key to our history. And so we're going to dive a little bit into that today so that we have some shared contextual history as we begin reading primary source documents. So come and join me as we jump in today. We're going to start by defining our terms. When we talk about slavery in the United States, we're talking about a system of chattel. Chattel is a legal term. It is defined as an item of property other than freehold land, including tangible goods and leasehold interests. Slavery is a legal system, right? So we've got a legal term, then we have a legal system, ranging from voluntary indentured servitude. The term slavery has been defined variously over the centuries, ranging from indentured servitude to pay off debts to matrilineal chattel slavery, where birth, specifically the birth mother, establishes lifelong servitude or freedom, a system that we had here in the United States. Therefore, chattel slavery is a civil relationship in which one person has absolute power over the life, fortune, and liberty of another, right? So chattel, that is property; slavery, establishment of servitude, right? So chattel slavery is ownership to establish servitude. It is a legal system that is, as far as we know right now, unique to Western colonies held by European nations between 1455 and 1890. Now, some forms of slavery did persist and do continue to persist around the world, but the specific legal system of chattel slavery was unique to this 400 or so year period in Western countries and Western colonies. So let's dive a little bit into the history here. There are prerequisites both for chattel slavery in America and for slavery writ large as a practice in our world. So if we go back to the prerequisites for historic slavery, it always begins when human cultures have 2 things: economic surplus and population density. That makes sense, right? You can't feed or pay or keep someone to do work for you if you don't have enough food to feed yourself. The returns are diminishing on that. So you have to have economic surplus, and you have to have a high enough population density to make this relationship valuable. And so those are the 2 prerequisites to ancient forms of slavery. And slavery does go back as far as written human history. Slavery was treated as an established institution in ancient historic texts that we have access to. The Christian Bible, for instance, Plato's idea of the Republic, Hammurabi's Code, all of these deeply, deeply ancient texts treat slavery as just a norm. This is just something that exists, sort of like having kings or having laborers, also having slaves. As far as historians are aware, there is no democracy or republic known to have existed without some form of slavery. Since we live in a democracy or a republic, depending on who you're talking to and how you're defining those words. Still today, I invite you to think about that complicated legacy. And then also it's important to remember, as a prerequisite to slavery in ancient history, slavery is a primary economic force of most wealthy pre-industrial cultures and nations, right? Ancient slavery is not limited to Western or European countries. Almost any wealthy pre-industrial society is going to have some of its wealth based around slavery. This means that there is a long history of slavery that starts far, far before folks defined or raced as white end up in the Americas. But it's a little bit different. Historic slavery is rarely based on lines of race as we now define it, as we'll talk about in a little bit. Race as an idea actually doesn't begin until much, much closer to our time than you might imagine. The one exception here is the ancient Hebrews, although they were also identified by religion and region. But the ancient Hebrews being enslaved in Egypt is a notable distinction here. Slavery in recorded history is actually usually associated with capture after the loss of a war. So, for instance, the Romans enslaved large numbers of Gauls and Euripians. They enslaved large numbers of Britons when they conquered Britain. So usually slavery in history is associated with capture or the loss during war, or with religious differences. So for instance, papal bulls from the 5th through the 12th century barred Christians from enslaving and selling to non-Christian countries. And although you were allowed to have Christian slaves, in the Byzantine Empire, they were a Muslim nation, they would often capture young Christian boys to be trained as literate slaves, and they specifically selected and fought to capture young Christian boys as their slaves. So the long history of slavery is often based in those deeply human-seeming ideas of war and religion. So if that is the long history of slavery, the next important thing to talk about is how we got to this new type of slavery, chattel slavery, in the United States and in the Americas. And there are three main prerequisites: private property ownership as a good, individuality, and a justification for dehumanizing the person considered to be chattel. Remember, we do not have those as prerequisites for the long history of slavery, right? You could easily in ancient Rome have enslaved a Gaul who had a different religion from you if you had captured him in battle. It didn't matter whether private property ownership was good, bad, or indifferent. Individuality was not at issue. You had captured this person. The thing at issue was your ability to hold them. That is different than what we get in chattel slavery in the Americas. So let's take a look at how that starts. I and a number of scholars trace this to the foundation of the international slave trade. The international slave trade makes slavery a money-making capitalist proposition instead of a war privilege. And that changes how slavery is allowed to function and the wherewithal it has as a legal system. So let's talk a little bit about the international slave trade. In 1452, a papal bull called the Dum de Veras gave Spain and Portugal the right to, and I quote here, reduce any Sacrians, pagans, and other unbelievers unto perpetual servitude. The Latin phrase here, dum de veras, translates as until different. So this is a papal bull designed to last in perpetuity. It is supposed to be for the remainder of human history when we're listening to papal bulls. And it gave all, quote, Christian lords the rights to do a couple of things. Listen to this. Invade, search out, capture, vanquish, and subdue all Sacrians and pagans whatsoever, and other enemies of Christ whatsoever placed, and the kingdoms, dukedoms, principalities, dominions, possessions, and all movable and immovable goods whatsoever held and possessed by them, and to reduce their persons to perpetual slavery, and to apply and appropriate to himself and his successors the kingdoms, dukedoms, countries, principalities, dominions, professions, and goods, and to convert them to his and their use and profit. Boy, there's a lot there. Let's break it down just a little bit. So the papal bull said that until such as a different time as another papal bull is issued, any Christian lord, this meant anyone who served the Pope and paid taxes to Rome, hold on to that, was able to invade, search out, right? So this gave you the right to go into other countries. There didn't have to be a reason. You just could now. And subdue all Sacrians and pagans. This is specifically Muslims. That's Sacrians. That is the word for Muslim in the 14th century. And pagans whatsoever. Anyone who doesn't pay taxes to Rome is defined as a pagan. And other enemies of Christ wheresoever placed. Think about that for a moment. Who gets to speak for Christ? The Pope. If the Pope gets to speak for Christ, the only people who are allowed to be Christian lords pay taxes to the Pope. Anyone who doesn't get to pay taxes to the Pope is an enemy of Christ. Neat how that works, isn't it? Anybody see maybe a financial motive for why this practice was instituted? Well, you would be right. That is because in the 13th century, 1300s, early 1400s, the Ottoman Empire, the Muslim Empire, had gained prominence over the Christian Empire. They had taken back Jerusalem. They were taking Spain. They were taking parts of Portugal. And Rome was losing its financial stability. That means the Pope was losing taxes. The Pope was in dire financial straits because the Ottoman Empire was gaining wealth instead of him. What does this new papal bull give the Pope the right to do? Glean taxes from anyone who fights against these Mormons or against these Muslims, right? This is what this originally is about, securing more financial access for Rome. But it has the ability to do something else. It creates what's known as the Doctrine of Discovery. The Roman Catholic Christian Church, not joined by Christians in Asia or Africa. We're not talking about the Ethiopian Christian Church. We're not talking about the Russian Orthodox Church or the Greek Orthodox Church. Just Rome defined itself as the only Christian empire, issued a decree that any land not currently ruled by those who supported the Roman Church could be conquered with the blessing of the Church. What does this mean? This means that all of the other Christians don't get to count only Rome. Why does that matter? Because then Rome gets the taxes, right? The Christian monarchs, therefore, financially support the papal see, but they had lost significant wealth when Muslim countries conquered the market on spices and sugar and silk from Eastern Asia. So think about, why is the doctrine of discovery so important? Its outflow is obviously the international slave trade, but it's important because it financially supports the papal see. Now, why is it important rhetorically? That's because the Dum de Verus officially linked slavery with Christianity. But Christianity is practiced around the world, right? There's Ethiopian Christian churches. There are sub-Saharan African Christian congregations that are this early or shortly thereafter. We have Greek, Roman, we have Greek, Russian, and Byzantine Orthodox Christian churches that all descend from the same Bible, that all descend from the same tradition. But the Roman Catholic Church needed this additional marker, right? So we need to think about this from a rhetorical perspective. Why link slavery to Roman Christianity? Well, first, because religion didn't work well because the Ottoman Empire was super strong. They were much, much stronger and richer than the warring Christian monarchs in Western Europe. So what happens? Well, they define people as heathen. Anyone who doesn't pay taxes to the Roman Christian Church, they're heathen. We can just get rid of them now. That's fine. But here's the problem. As you begin going around the world, heathen doesn't work so much anymore because people in other countries are willing to be converted to Christianity, especially tribes in Western Africa and the Eastern Americas. They're willing to incorporate elements of Christianity. We remember that the conquistadors often forcibly converted. Spanish conquistadors often forcibly converted people to Christianity. So then they're Christians, and heathen doesn't work so much anymore. That provides another problem. And that's why around the 1600s, we begin to see race become a valuable marker of what can be linked to slavery. And this is where we get into race. Religion didn't work. Heathen didn't work. We needed a new rhetorical tactic as a way to have chattel slavery continue paying dividends to the Roman See. And that brings us to race. Currently, in our world today, in the 21st century, the definition of race is a grouping of humans based on shared physical or social qualities into categories generally viewed as distinct by society. This means race is a rhetorical construct. It's not based on scientific research, and it's not based on biological evidence. It's really important that you understand race is socially constructed, right? It groups humans based on shared physical or social qualities as perceived by a society. But that's not the only definition. Historic definitions have been a little bit different. Before the 14th century, before the Dum de Veras, a group of humans who speak the same language was often considered a race, right? So the race of Spaniards or the race of the British. Between the 10th and 14th centuries, so even earlier, we often see people sharing a religious tradition. So you'll hear the Moorish race or the Christian race. These are often used to justify anti-Semitism in these early centuries in Europe. But then between the 15th and the 17th centuries, we get into nationalism. Humans of the same nationality become the definition of race. So anyone who follows the British monarch is part of the British race. The French race are those who follow the French king. The Prussians are a race. So those definitions, you see, have changed throughout history. And if you follow Western history, if you've taken a Western Civ class, you'll be able to mark these historical definitions to the rhetorical work that they can do. But those definitions were set up to change after the Dum de Veras. So let's talk about those changing definitions. On the left of your screen, you'll see the altarpiece from Herminius Bosch's altarpiece in Ghent, Belgium. This was painted between 1485 and 1500. And you will see that one of the wise men, actually the leader, usually Balthazar, who presents gold to Mary and the infant Jesus, he is portrayed as Ethiopian, as someone whose skin would be black. But because he's following Christ, and because he is a king, he is portrayed as a member of the Christian race, a devout member of the Christian race. Not that long after, about 200 years later, we begin to see in Kuhn's portrait a different depiction of race. You can see that the character in the back is rendered much less effectively than the character in the foreground, that he is presented as pleading, as indifferent. The child is given all of the accoutrement of wealth and power and knowledge. The other character in this painting is not. He is made silent. But this continues. We see changing definitions that begin to even further dehumanize as we get into the late 18th and early 19th centuries. So this is a Samuel Jennings painting here in the United States, Liberty displaying the arts and sciences. And you can see that Liberty is, of course, white and blonde-haired, white-skinned and blonde-haired. And there's actually a number of people of color, number of people who are portrayed with black skin or as part of what would at this point be known as the African race, whether they had lived in Africa in any recent point in time or not. But Liberty is teaching them, it's a very white messiah or white savior kind of ideal. And then if you go even further, by the 19th century, John Lewis Kimmel's quilting frolic, we begin to see the truly racist caricatures all the way on the right side of your screen. You will see a fiddle player whose skin is rendered black with many of the typical dehumanizing characteristics, the incredibly overblown lips, the smaller stature, the hunchback, the jutting chin, and those depictions, right? These depictions, these pictures display that change in definition. When we go from Herminius Bosch's altarpiece all the way to Kimmel's quilting frolic, we see the dehumanization of people based specifically on a new definition, that is skin color. And so we begin to get to the prerequisites for modern chattel slavery. Remember, I said every form of slavery had to have some kind of social order, some kind of social construction that required or that facilitated it being there. In modern chattel slavery, we have private property ownership, individuality, and a justification for dehumanizing the person considered chattel. So that justification, we're going to see it in the definition of race. So American slavery, if we think about American slavery as a unique thing, it extended beyond the Americas, but because we're in an American public discourse class, we are going to focus just on the U.S. context. Slavery existed in the Americas, in the American continents, well before the European Christians arrived. The Aztec Empire, centered in Tenochtitlan, had a class of people who were indentured or enslaved themselves to pay off debt. This was a very common role that one might take on. The Haidao, the Nauchuchali, the Tlingit, the Coast Chishmani, and other tribes from the Pacific Northwest coast, so specifically Canada, Oregon, Washington states, or what are now those states, they were well known as raiders and slave traders. There was a thriving trade in slaves going on in the West Coast. But North American slavery was associated with warfare or with debt, as we've known from early human history, not chattel slavery. And as far as historians are able to tell, chattel slavery likely didn't exist in the Americas. European Christians, when they originally arrived here, did try to enslave native populations. Right? We think about Cortez coming to Central America and enslaving people, a lot of Spaniards on the West Coast. That was very, very common. Of course, these fell under pagans and other enemies of Christ, and so they had the blessing of the church to do that. Problem is, all of those supposed pagans, all of those so-called heathens, are actually better at navigating this country than the conquerors are actually better equipped to deal with things like local pests and dangers. And so it's much, much harder to enslave people when they know the land and the territory better than you do. So even though they have the blessing of the Roman Catholic Church, it's very difficult to enslave native populations for Western colonizers in the Americas. And so instead, we begin to see the system of American chattel slavery, especially associated with folks with black skin from Africa. In 1619, black indentured servants who will not be freed when their debts are paid are brought to the Americas. Less than 1,000 black folks, though, lived in the colonies before the 1650s. So in the first generation or two of Europeans actually living here in what would become the United States, there's not a lot of black people, and most of them are not enslaved. However, this number in Virginia alone rises to over 3,000 within 30 years, right? Not all of the colonies, just Virginia. We're not counting Georgia, we're not counting the Carolinas, we're not counting Louisiana or Mississippi or Alabama or any of those other places. Right? We're just talking about Virginia. There's already 3,000. The population explodes of black people. Many more of them are now becoming slaves or indentured servants. And so we get Bacon's Rebellion in the 1660s. Bacon's Rebellion brings together hundreds, literally hundreds, of enslaved and indentured folks who are both white and black, and brings them together to overthrow the unfair feudal labor laws in Virginia. However, it is brutally suppressed by a military force with greater power. We're familiar with this from our studies of history, right? The greater power of the military, even if it has smaller numbers of people, has the ability to conquer an uprising. Well, they do, and they do so brutally, but less brutally for the white indentured servants than for the black slaves and indentured servants. Specifically, any person considered to be black is instantly killed or tried and hung, whereas any person considered to be white who participated in the rebellion is only jailed or beaten, but then allowed to go back to their lives. Now, there are still major labor shortages after Bacon's Rebellion between the 1660s and the 1700s. And so we begin to see what are called patrious laws. We're going to talk about patrious laws in just a minute. But by 1705, we begin seeing what are known as slave codes. And the slave codes explicitly define being black as a marker of being a slave. It is the way that it is defined, being black, right? So it's based on visual cues. And it gives specific greater punishments for crimes committed by black enslaved people. Remember, that category is going to be elided. Those are going to be the same things than it does for white people who are indentured or enslaved. So that's going to be really important because remember, slavery is a civil system enforced by laws. Specifically, matrilineal laws. That patris law, it means the status follows the mother. Now, previous slaves or previous enslaving cultures had always allowed slavery to follow the father. So if your father was enslaved as the head of the household, he was responsible to you and for you. What does that mean? Well, if you own someone and you have a child with that person, that child is entitled to all of your rights, all of the privileges of being an owner. But that's going to complicate that question of race, isn't it? Because the white planting owner, and remember you have to be white by the mid-1700s in order to own slaves, the status is going to follow the mother. You can no longer petition for your father, if he is your owner, to address you as an offspring. This is first established by Elizabeth Key, who was enslaved, fell in love with her owner, and had children with him, and then wanted her children claimed. She wanted her owner to claim and free her children. The law was established that it would follow the mother. Now remember, we're still talking Britain here. The United States as a country doesn't exist yet. So the rights of subjecthood, meaning English speaking and Christian, is what's important here, not race. In 1662, the Virginia House of Burgesses passes a patris law, and other colonies follow within a decade, and this legalizes a couple of things. First, matrilineal chattel slavery. So if a slave has a child, that child is enslaved with her regardless of the child's father. It also legalizes sexual exploitation and rape of non-subject women by male subjects. We're making a legal distinction here along the lines of race. And that gives us that first prerequisite for chattel slavery, a justification for dehumanizing the person considered chattel. So how do we get the other two? Well, it's going to come down to Enlightenment individuality. Since we've spent so much time on the Declaration and the Constitution, you're already familiar with the ideas of Enlightenment individuality. Classical liberalism says it has a belief in individual freedoms, the fundamental moral equality of individuals, a legal system based on that equality, and a representative form of government benefiting a society of those free individuals. This is also going to be core in Protestant Christianity as it develops in the 17th and 18th centuries. Individual salvation, which is increasingly vital during the Protestant revolutions, the First Great Awakening and the Second Great Awakening here in the United States. There we have that individuality that we need. My individual rights as a citizen. And that's going to be absolutely vital. We see it in the language of equality and in the language of the Constitution. So the definition then falls on what it means to be an individual. And this is still the 16th and 17th centuries. So the definitions of a rational citizen are the same as the definitions for subject: male, white, of the prevailing religion, which in the United States is Protestantism, and property owning. Therefore, any rational citizen, think about those words, rational citizen, should have a natural right to life and property, not dictated by the will of a monarch, which is much more collective. The monarch is supposed to be about what is best for us as a country. The individual should have a natural right to what is right for himself. In the American colonies and the American Revolution, a reaction to the collectivity benefiting the monarch, right? King George saying, well, we're all part of the same country, so you need to pay taxes. No, the Americans weren't having that, right? They threw that off in favor of Enlightenment individuality, that second prerequisite for chattel slavery. And that brings us to that final one, private property ownership as a natural good. And for that, we need to understand why the Americas were colonized by Europeans in the first place. We know about the Spanish and the Portuguese going and colonizing. We know about the Catholic Church, but you'll notice that the majority of people in America are Protestant, and we speak English, not Spanish, if we come from white Western European lineage. Why is that? Well, that's because Northwestern European countries saw the American colonies as an economic opportunity for fourth sons. So a lot of things happened during the 17th century. We began to see better abilities to take care of people, better health care. There were fewer plagues, and so people lived longer. People were more likely to have more children. Therefore, they needed something to do with those children. If your first son would inherit your estate, your second son would go into the military, your third son would go into the clergy. What would you do with your fourth sons? The answer was property in the new colonies. Here's the thing, though. If you've got enough money to endow all of your sons with these inheritances, chances are good your fourth son probably didn't go up doing a lot of individual personal farm labor. Maybe he supervised some, but even that's pretty unlikely. So fourth sons are pretty terrible farmers, and therefore they're increasing the enslaved populations to do the farming for them. But now there are far more people enslaved than there are fourth sons who claim to be their owners. If there are several hundred slaves on any given plantation, they could easily overthrow the plantation owners. And there's also an increasing worldwide shipping trade, which offers lucrative individual opportunities for selling those goods manufactured by enslaved folks. So what exactly are you going to do? You have now found private property ownership as a natural good. You as a fourth son, or I as a fourth son, have found that private property ownership is a good. Individuality is our national religion, and there is a justification for dehumanizing the person considered chattel because we have defined race as a dehumanizing characteristic. That means the stage is set for American chattel slavery. But you might be thinking, but wait, that violates all those principles of classical liberalism, doesn't it? Doesn't that violate the idea of like equality and all those things that were written? We just spent time reading about these. They're in our founding documents. Well, this is where the rub comes in. Because we have a justification and legalizing of American chattel slavery. There is first an economic necessity of slave labor in the South. There is a rhetoric constructed to say that we absolutely have to have this enslavement, as you'll see in our readings for today, because we can't possibly do this work ourselves. There is a religious justification offered for black chattel slavery. One of the rhetorics is, it's so good of us as Europeans and as Americans to buy these enslaved individuals because then we can make them Christians. There are notable dissenters here. not just within African American communities, but within various religious communities. If you ever want to look into why there is a Southern Baptist tradition, that will tell you a lot about that. There's also the positive good of black slavery as, and remember this word, civilizing. Civilizing. Some would say that a society that enslaves people based matrilineally is perhaps not as civilized as it thinks it is, but there was a social rhetoric that said civilizing by being enslaved was actually a good thing for enslaved populations. And then there's a humanitarian justification. Isn't it nice of us to rescue these people from their paganism, their Muslim faith, whatever awful conditions they had before? Remember, few people would have actually seen any conditions, the happiness of enslaved populations before they were enslaved, not something people would have paid attention to. And so all of these become justifications and lead to the legalization of American chattel slavery, specifically with a couple of laws. The Naturalization Act, the Immigration and Naturalization Act of 1790, says that only any free white person, it actually specifies white, which at the time only meant Western, Northern European. They are the only ones able to be naturalized as citizens in the new country. In 1793 and 1850, fugitive slave laws are passed, saying that you don't actually have individual freedom to treat other humans the way you want because they, in fact, are property that belong to someone else, and that supersedes their right to property, supersedes your right to any moral or religious belief. There are anti-miscegenation laws that institute race as a marker for marriage, that you are not allowed to marry anyone outside of your race. These are passed state by state, nationwide, and each state that is admitted to the Union does have to have an anti-miscegenation law. Individual state codes preventing immigration based on race are enacted before the Civil War. The 1850 Fugitive Slave Act effectively federalized slavery, right? So don't give me anything about states' rights. The northern states' rights were not at issue because they had gotten rid of chattel slavery, but the southern states wanted their property back. So we federalized slavery with the 1850 Fugitive Slave Act. And then finally, the 1857 Dred Scott decision and the legalization specifically of race. Dred Scott is specifically a free person of color and does not look black to most people. There are court documents that he passes, that's what it's called, passing, that he passes as white. But because he is ethnically black, that means they can trace his ancestry to someone who was black, that legalized him being discriminated against, right? So we go even beyond those visible characteristics in the Dred Scott decision and legalize race based on assumption or assertion of ethnicity. This is often called the one-drop rule. And this takes us right up to the Civil War. So we have talked through a lot of history here. I appreciate you sticking with me for this longer than usual introduction, but we're going to bring a lot of these themes and a lot of this history into our discussion of how race has shaped our history and our public discourse. I can't wait to talk to you all.